John Theroux here, just recording a message from my friend David. I just wanted to talk about my father. My dad's name was Marc Albert Theroux. He was born on August 6th, 1955 to Verna and Eugene Theroux. Eugene was a veteran and Verna was a working class woman. My father began drinking beer at age 12, and that later turned into a chronic problem with alcohol for him. He worked from approximately 1970 until his death in 2013 as a mechanic and then later as a general construction contractor. In 2004, my father met a man by the name of David Huckins, who lives in Bosquen, New Hampshire, and currently runs a company called Huckleberry Heating Oil. Mr. Huckins became friends with my father and shortly thereafter himself had a little run-in with the law, getting arrested for driving while intoxicated after driving his Ford F-250 into a tree while he was drunk driving home from the bar one night. Sweet. Ironically, Mr. Huckins lost his license after that, like Marc later would in his life, and Marc actually did a lot for Dave. He drove him around, helped him out, and I remember Dave was kind of down in the dumps, but he was still a really nice guy, and I liked him a lot. David eventually got his license back and got his life back together and continued running his Huckleberry Heating Oil company. And Marc did a lot of work with Huckleberry Heating Oil. As a contractor, he built one of their garages in Loudon, New Hampshire, and he built their office, their first main office in Bosquen, New Hampshire. Now, as everybody knows, in 2008 there was a financial recession and it hit the building industry especially hard. My father, being a general contractor, was hit very hard by this. I remember material prices went up, and as material prices went up, work went down, and my father continued to go from a functioning alcoholic to a chronic alcoholic. My father was arrested for driving while intoxicated in 2009 after a domestic violence incident that led to him getting kicked out of his childhood home and my childhood home as well. Shortly thereafter, he lived on his own and began another spell of chronic alcoholism, and in 2010 he started having fainting spells. Shortly after these fainting spells started, Marc fell and hit his head, and David Huckins and my friend Chuck went to help Marc and take him to the hospital because he needed to be taken care of, and we all agreed on that. And in 2010, after my mother decided to purchase our home from Mr. Theroux, my dad, David Huckins began to help my father a little bit more, getting his mail sent to the Huckleberry Heating Oil office in Bosquen, New Hampshire, and helping him out where he could. And he appreciated that. I appreciated it too. In 2011, my father actually bought a house down the street from Dave Huckins in Bosquen, New Hampshire, and they were neighbors. David had to drive by Marc's house every single day on his way home. Despite Marc's chronic problems with alcohol and his constant relapses, Mr. Huckins would still stop by and have a beer with Marc just every day he could. Marc eventually, though, because I am his son, did have difficulties with me because I didn't want him to drink anymore, actually started to consider Mr. Huckins more of a family member than me. David and I were almost like brothers at one point, it seemed like, because we would talk on a regular basis and we would try to help Marc in any way we could. Now, this is where things get interesting. After I turned to David for help, we both kind of got sick of it after a while, and we kind of gave up. Both of us kind of gave up, and Marc was just a chronic alcoholic who was incontinent and couldn't control himself, couldn't control his behavior, couldn't control his violent, angry outbursts, etc. David and I both stopped caring for Marc for a while, but David returned shortly before I did. And in 2012, I believe it was September, David came up with the brilliant idea that he was going to buy Marc's house from him so he could live there for the rest of his life rent-free and help Marc out in any way he could by giving him work, by giving him money for the electric bill, and running a heating oil company. Naturally, David was going to pay for his heat and hot water. David visited Marc knowing about his chronic mental health issues in addition to his substance abuse issues with alcohol and tobacco. And despite that, he allowed Marc to drink alcohol and lower his inhibitions, and then offered Marc a contract stating that he could live there for the rest of his life, rent-free, and that he would take care of everything. But it didn't exactly work that way because Marc passed away suspiciously about a year later, almost exactly a year after this contract was signed. Mr. Huckins took it to lord himself over my father to the point that he was going to be the one selecting who came and went from that house. And with that said, even though my father and I didn't have the best relationship, Mr. Huckins decided to bar me from going to my father's house by filing a no trespass order on me, saying that I was not allowed to set foot on the premises, which was fine by me. David later claimed that Marc wanted this, but I actually remember Marc begging Dave on more than one occasion to take the order down because Marc wanted a relationship with his son. Simply put, just wanted a relationship with his son. And in hindsight, I wanted a relationship with my father as well. David continued to lord himself over my father and act like he was the one in charge of his life until my father's tragic death on September 13th, 2013. I was visited by New Hampshire State Police early one morning in August of 2013 and offered to file for an involuntary emergency admission on Marc. And at the time, I was so done with everything because of what Marc has put me and my family through that I wasn't willing to do it. Marc later fell and broke his hip, unfortunately, and was in the hospital, and I visited him for the last time I ever saw my father alive, and saw him to, be very mentally ill, very depressed, and very lethargic, common symptoms of major depressive disorder. And within the month, my father ended up passing away, falling down his stairs, allegedly falling down his stairs, to his death, breaking his skull open and bleeding to death. I'll never forget the call I got from Mr. Huckins at 12:25 p.m. on September 13th, 2013, while I was walking down the blinds aisle at my job at Lowe's at the time, and wondering what the hell was going on now. David had informed me of my father's passing, and I immediately went up to the house, with his permission, of course, went up to the house and, talked to the medical examiner and the Boscawen, New Hampshire Police Department to determine what had happened and what we were going to do with Mr. Theroux's body. After being forced into a funeral bill that I knowingly could not pay, and with the gracious help of the funeral home director, who was a friend of my neighbor, I know that sounds confusing, Mr. Huckins and his wonderful wife Tracy decided to foot the bill for Marc's funeral, with the one cause that they were going to have a memorial service for Marc. In a later conversation with my mother, I learned that my father never wanted a memorial service. So, the Huckins family actually desecrated my father's last wishes, which is a very typical thing that they like to do. After the Huckins family funeral for Mr. Theroux, my father, that I did not attend because I knew that it wasn't what he wanted, I was offered so graciously by David to come to the house and collect my father's belongings. Little did I know, Mr. Huckins had already gone through the house to find the things that he wanted and took them. So that's really nice, really classy thing to do. Instead of giving me the next of kin, the person whose house that actually is, the house or anything in it, David just told me my father, like I said, was incontinent, so the house was filled with feces and urine stained clothing, carpets, etc. And there are photos that document the mess. Mr. Huckins just informed me, "Oh, yep, ServPro is going to come take care of it. No big deal. Yeah." No, ServPro is not going to take care of it, Dave. ServPro is not going to clean up the mess. David apologized to me profusely, saying that, I didn't want to put that order on there. Your father wanted it. He wanted it. No, David, it clearly was you that wanted to keep me from my father in his last days. And that makes me, and everyone I've told this story to, sick. David did have ServPro go and clean out the house, and later on he ended up renting out the house to a couple of tenants, and he just calmly and cool didn't even actually do any renovations to the house or fix the things that Marc was starting out, but just rented out the house casually to get himself a nice little income to pay for his nice new 2016 F-150 Platinum Edition that I noticed he bought shortly before I moved out of New Hampshire. And wow, he has a nice new office that my father's house is paying for. That makes me sick. And that brings us to the modern day, where I've relocated to the West Coast to escape this horrible life of financial ruin that would have been completely avoided if my father's house had been a